So this evening, as our closing event, we'll be reflecting on the past 5 editions of the festival and the Arab cinema landscape, both in the UK and across the region. And for our final event, I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic lineup of professionals from the film industry. We've changed things a little bit this evening, so chairing this conversation is Saeed Taji Farouky, who is one of the co-founders of SAFAR, which was established in 2012. And he's played a key role in the delivery of the festival ever since. Saeed has also been producing and directing documentaries and fiction films around themes of conflict, human rights, and colonialism since 1998. You can check out all his brilliant work on touristwithatypewriter.com if you're interested to know more about what he does. And joining him tonight are Khalid Abdalla, who's an actor, producer, and filmmaker, Butheina Kazim, who's co-founder and director of Cinema Akil in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And last but not least, of course, this year's SAFAR Film Festival curator, Rabih el Khoury, who tonight is actually going to be answering questions rather than asking them. So please welcome our guests, and I hope you enjoy this event.
Cool, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here as well and for joining us. And if any of you would like to, so just a reminder to keep your microphones on mute. But if you would like to, I always find it better if you're okay with it to keep your camera on, those of you who are just in the audience, because then it makes it seem more like a conversation rather than just speaking into a void. So if you're comfortable with that, it's always a nice addition for you. As Amani mentioned, my name is Saeed Taji Farouky. I'm going to briefly introduce the 3 panelists we have today for the conversation, and then we'll run it really like a casual chat. I don't want it to be too formal, although some of the ideas are going to be probably big and probably quite heavy, but we'll keep it as casual as possible. So, Khalid Abdalla, if you just wave there so everyone can see where you are. Khalid, there you are. Khalid Abdalla is an actor, producer, and alternative media activist. He's played leading roles in a range of films, from Hollywood titles like United 93, Green Zone, and The Kite Runner, to independent Arab cinema, like In the Last Days of the City, a film that we showed recently in our program, and The Narrow Frame of Midnight. He's the founding member of 3 collaborative media initiatives in Cairo, Cimatech, Zero Production, and Mosirin. He was brought up in the UK to Egyptian parents, and Cairo and London are his twin cities. So please welcome Khalid Abdalla. And next, Butheina Kazim, if you could give us a wave, please, so everyone can identify you. Butheina Kazim is founder of Cinema Akil, the only independent art house cinema in the Gulf. She was a Fulbright Scholar of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, and is a member of the UAE Academy Award Committee. She's a member of the steering committee of the Network of Arab Alternative Screens, where Cinema Akil is a member, and she lives and works in Dubai. So welcome, Butheina. And finally, Rabih el Khoury, who hopefully you all recognize, but please give us a wave anyway. There he is. Rabih el Khoury is a curator, programmer, and fosters emerging talents. He was a manager of Metropolis Art Cinema, the only art cinema in Lebanon, and worked for Beirut, DC for the promotion of Arab cinema as general coordinator for its Arab Film Festival. Since 2014, he has been the program manager of Berlinale Talents in Beirut, and he programs and organizes over 20 Arab film weeks in the Arab world and Europe. So welcome, Rabia. We have sort of a huge question, really. I mean, the basic question of this is, how has Arab cinema changed since the first edition of SAFAR in 2012? But I'm going to narrow it a bit. So I'd like to ask first, I'd like to start with Khalid, because as an actor, you are sort of on the side of the most visible changes in Arab cinema. That's what happens on the screen. So I'm curious, from your perspective, so much has happened in the Middle East since 2012. And even looking at our first program, we didn't really reflect the so-called Arab Spring in the 2012 edition. We just didn't have the capacity to do it. But at this point, do you feel like Arab cinema has the capacity to deal with the major questions of the Arab world?
Wow, that's a very big question. I mean, from 2012 till now, I feel like I have been through, I don't know how many worlds, and probably everyone else feels the same, but at least 7.
Mm-hmm.
The world over, and certainly in our region. And 2012 for me is I'm still in the heart of the upsurge from 2011. And as you're forcing me to sort of like take that journey over those 8 years, it's different for every country for sure, but certainly in my journey around, it starts to go this way, 2013 to 16, and then we're in a big, we're somewhere else now, the world over. It's an extraordinary, this is the first time I've done one of these.
Oh, really?
It's an extraordinary thing to see all these faces. Thank you, everyone. Who I know and those of you who I don't. It's a very special experience, although of course at the same time a very sad one. The funny thing is, I had this moment in a conversation when COVID hit in relation to Cinematech, one of the initiatives that you mentioned, which I'm a founding member of, and it was a conversation in response to COVID, and one of our supporters kind of wanting to have a conversation with us to work out how they can help us, or ways in which things might be able to shift. And there was this sudden realization of a moment of like, we've been in crisis management since 2011, if not before. This is sort of a weird question of actually, have we ever been out of crisis management? Are we in some ways, as a region, as a cinema, best prepared to deal with the kind of extraordinary ruptures that keep happening? The idea of planning is a joke. It's a good joke which has stuck with me always, which is, how do you make God laugh? You tell him about your plans.
Yeah.
And certainly, throughout that period, that's very much been a big part of my experience. I didn't imagine I'd be here in 2012, that we'd be here in this way, and I didn't imagine last year that this would be the case. So, things are worse, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that whatever it is that, the broad series of things that happened in that wider moment, because it's not, here we're starting 2012 because of SAFAR. For me, I would start probably 10 years before that, actually, in terms of the wave that I think that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a generation for whom the spread of that moment is formative, we are in the energy of that moment still. All of us, wherever we, all of us, I think, across Arab cinema, whatever our relationship with the turbulence of 2011 onwards, which again stretches back at a minimum to 2003, if not 2001. Right. Don't forget, because of the nature of our cinema, the amount of time that it takes to make projects, right? I mean, In the Last Days of the City is maybe a specific case, but even, it took us 10 years to make it. But at a minimum, it's, you're talking 5 years as well, like, So this process of lag and also one of the things I love about our cinema, because it's so difficult to make, is it requires an extraordinary fortitude.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be inside it, it sort of encourages a kind of radicalism, or at least it encourages you to go there. You may not. And some people don't, some people do, some people don't, some people go too far, you know, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. I wasn't expecting to say any of this, so I hope as an impromptu answer, it has the beginning of the spirit of one, which maybe we'll find more out in the next hour.
Sure.
But that's what, you know, that's what I'd say.
In terms of the roles you've been offered, I mean, Hollywood films maybe a different subject, but what sort of changes have you noticed?
Well, no, I mean, as an actor, I mean, okay, I mean, I don't know. I'm a weird kind of actor because I'm not just an actor. And also as an Arab actor, I mean, an Arab actor, I think is a very, like, I find that as an actor, I can't just be an actor. And actually, I don't want to just be an actor. If I'm to sit at home and wait for scripts to arrive to me, either I'll never work, or I'll do a lot of work I don't want to do. And I think, you know, so therefore I find that my part of that as an actor, I have to engage in the process of making.
Right.
Whether that's as an author of my own work, whether that's as a producer, as in The Last Days, or whether that's as in building places like Cinematech, or whether that's on the streets and in the barricades with Mousserine when it came to it, right? So it depends really what kind of work you're talking about. In terms of the landscape of what work, kind of comes to you as an actor, it's not very much. I mean, there is stuff that comes. I mean, if we're talking in a British specific context, there has been a kind of change which is goes beyond Britain in terms of diversity casting,
yeah,
you know, as it's called, which is a problematic concept. It opens doors, but it's problematic because you know, I find there's a problem with color blindness, for example. I'm not interested in a colorblind world. I'm interested in a colorful world.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think color blindness has its place, but I think, you know, the specificity of everyone's stories has a right to be told and should be told. And we confront very often the infrastructural reasons why some people's stories get told more than others, or why certain kinds of faces are more likely to play best friends, or are more likely to play, you know, evil people, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you know, so yeah, there has been a shift, but my God, is there a long way to go? And there's also a very long way to go in our cinema.
Yeah, yeah.
Any role, I'm aware that I'm sort of maybe talking too much here, but I think any role which is not the originator of a project, you know, so editors, actors, cinematographers, unless you are really the author, the author of the project, you are in a situation where you are what do I want to say? You know, you are dependent.
You're
dependent.
Someone else's.
You're dependent on the state of the industry as a whole, right?
Yeah.
It's not. It's in kind of the grand terms of what everyone expects and dreams of cinema. It's a weak industry. It's a beautiful, but it's a weak one.
And I always feel like we should say oh, sorry.
No, yeah, and that's why you have you know, you have a lot of people in our cinema who play multiple roles, or who maybe are really in their soul cinematographers, but you know, they want to work at the level that they can, so they start originating works, or in that, you know, some part of them is an editor, but they also, you know, so we're always doing that, and it's yeah.
I always feel like we should say Arab cinema industries rather than just industry, because it's, you know, it's not a singular industry, and in fact, someone
I think we can say both. I think we can say both, because I also think we are a community.
Yes.
No, we are very much so in a community. I mean, my experiences with Ness, for example, which, you know, I'm a big part and was a big part of in various different ways, or our intersections over film festivals, the fact that we in general face the same problems. You know, if you look at this rise, even with Nest, right, of the different cinemas in different cities and the provenance of them, like there's something that really binds us, and we need each other, especially if we're going to talk about Arab cinema, you know, because like the number of screens that we have across the region is very few, right? Yeah. So we need each other, and we're constantly needing to send each other our films and traveling, you know, and the way that's grown with the film festivals and so on. I think it's fair to talk about us as an Arab cinema, but of course, absolutely, each one of us has its specificity.
Yeah, and I mean, you'll notice in the bios that I gave for Rabih and Butheina, they each run the only art house cinema in their countries, and that really speaks to a problem there is across the Middle East, the Arab world in general, that the number of independent art house cinemas in the Arab world is less than the number of art house cinemas in Germany on its own. So so certainly there's not a huge amount of space.
Yeah, there used to be a statistic which I knew was probably gone slightly out of date, but which I think there were less screens, not cinemas, less screens across the entire Arab region than there are in Poland.
That sounds like it could be true.
Nothing wrong with that, Poland-wise. I mean, you know, but I'm just, you know,
it's great for Poland, yeah.
Putting it in context, if you're trying to build an industry, or if you're trying to make a return on your money.
Yeah,
it means that, you know, unless you're dealing with whoever owns the satellite TV stations and their politics, you're, you know.
And Butheina, you're in a unique position in that you have seen the sort of the creation, the rise of a film industry in the Gulf that didn't really exist, say, 10 years ago. What does that look like from your perspective?
Look, the one thing that, you know, marks the sort of the major shift in the Gulf sort of film landscape, but vis-a-vis the rest of the Arab world, is that there was a moment, you know, since the creation of the Dubai International Film Festival and the many iterations of the Abu Dhabi Film Festival, which was the Middle East Film Festival before that, and, you know, went through a lot of different sort of identity crises, and then there was the Doha Tribeca moment, and then there was the Doha moment, and then there was the Khumra moment, and then there was the rift that sort of, you know, that sidelined, you know, Doha in its play, and then the big promise of the Saudi Arabian opening, right? There was this kind of euphoric moment that everybody, you know, pre-pandemic was awaiting, you know, with both trepidation and excitement, you know, on both fronts. And I think, you know, that in itself, the sort of the departure of that, you know, custodianship role, you know, for all intents and purposes, kind of brought the industry, or the sort of the bet on, you know, on a larger Arab cinema industry, you know, back to the sort of the dire kind of / you know, radical, you know, roots of what an industry can look like. You know, I think while, you know, creating a network like NAS, you know, allows us to find, you know, points of, you know, solidarity and points of commonality and a real investment in, you know, in sort of in the championing of, you know, of our larger narrative and our each other's narratives. It also created a sort of you know, an authenticity that perhaps, you know, was being you know, politicized or weaponized, you know, through the existence of these sort of state-driven structures. But the flip side of that, obviously, you know, along with that, you know, disappeared the larger, you know, sort of capitalistic you know, industry you know, governance, you know, that went along, you know, that is part and parcel of the festival formula, you know, and the industries that it attracts, and the producers that come, and the variety coverage, and the Hollywood Reporter, you know, Middle East editions that came with that, you know, and, you know, most importantly, the potential funding opportunities as well, and the opportunity for these festivals to create a different kind of, you know, Arab story, you know, a different kind of Arab story. It doesn't follow the formula of, you know, of diaspora necessarily programming, you know, which is you know, a byproduct of a particular, you know, socio-political condition. That I think that opportunity was never, you know, bridged or never really fulfilled. And, you know, and with the departure of the festivals, or the indefinite postponement of them, you know, shall we say, you know, a lot of that kind of went back to square one, and forced, I guess, you know, filmmakers operating in the Gulf, but also in the Arab world, to, you know, seek other opportunities and seek other, you know, formulas, and operate, you know, in a way that it, you know, has always been sort of natural to the landscape in the crevices, you know, and triumphantly so. And you know, from my perspective, it is definitely a lot more difficult, but it is a lot more gratifying, you know, to operate on that level. And I think the other thing that's been really interesting to witness is the sort of shift in what is considered, you know, on a global level, sort of, you know, the representational aspects of diversity politics and POC, you know, narratives and so on, in the sort of, in the Euro-Amerocentric, you know, context and framing of that, and the recognition of, you know, certain names, you know, on a sort of, on the mainstreaming of the Arab image, particularly the Arab male image. But you know, in our region also kind of an evening or a change in what, you know, is the sort of representative capacity of Arab cinema. You know, you're starting to see, for example, an industry in Tunisia, you know, shape up in a way that, you know, is in itself, you know, sustaining. It has its problems, and they have, you know, and they have their challenges, but, you know, it is effectively a healthy, growing, you know, promise of an industry that, you know, came outside, that operated or was created outside of the sort of the formula or the, you know, the structure of the conventional, you know, festival, you know, industry centers and hubs sort of, you know, path that, you know, the sort of the Gulf route, you know, was taking. You know, you're also seeing more representation. I mean, through NASA, NASA is a great example of this, because you're not, you know, there is no more, you know, there isn't a sort of a monopolization of what you know, what consists of, you know, Arab representational, you know, politics. You have a, you know, a much more also, I think, conscious effort, you know, by both exhibitors, distributors, you know, and producers, to look at narratives that, you know, that question what the idea of an Arab, you know, film is, or the idea of the Arab film industry is. And I mean, you know, what's been really great, for example, in the past year, is to see the sort of the rise and the return of Sudanese cinema, for example, and have that lead the sort of the conversation around what is representing or carrying the mantle of Arab cinema in international festivals. And Palestinian cinema remains, you know, resistant, triumphant, you know, throughout the different waves, in a way embodying the concept of its resiliency, you know, despite the changes in the rest of the region. We're all just catching up with it.
Yeah, I think think it's interesting to see which countries, let's say, came out of their revolutions with a much stronger film industry. I mean, which managed to exploit it, and which you know, sort of failed. I think Tunisia is a great success story. I would argue the Egyptian film industry is in a lot of trouble now. So it's sort of moved backwards since its revolutions, in plural. Rabia, I'd like to hear your opinions on what do you think are successful film industries that have emerged from the last 8 years stronger than they were?
I have a hard time with the word industry. I'm not sure we have an industry at all in the Arab world, to be honest. We have interesting stories. We have, how do you say, we have appealing experiences, experiments. We are building into something that might look like an industry, but I'm not sure we have an industry the way France has a film industry, the way Scandinavia has a film industry, the way Hollywood is a film industry, the way Nollywood in Nigeria is an industry. I'm not sure the Arab world has a film industry. What we have are experiments. What we have are people with strong will who want to produce their films. people who find support from initiatives that support these films, that support them as filmmakers. I think also Butheina mentioned that even though these Gulf festivals started with like the glamour aspect of it, but in the end, the markets that they produced was substantial support for these filmmakers. Many filmmakers in the Arab world were known because of these platforms in Dubai and Abu Dhabi at some point. I'm not sure how this functions as an industry. I think also Khalid mentioned that now there are so many festivals in the Arab world, which is a great thing. There are so many platforms that support filmmakers, which is a great thing. But what is support? I mean, you don't have infrastructures that support filmmakers or that support film projects when you look at the broader scale. What are the funds in the Arab world that support Arab filmmakers to do their projects? You can count them on the hands, you know. You can say there is Al Mawrid, you can say there is the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, and this and that, and that's it. So basically, you don't have an infrastructure that says this project is going to get funded, this project is going to be supported to be distributed, this project will find its way to the audience because of this support or this or that. The way the Arab world operates is really on, you know, on a single basis, you know. You do things the way you learn to do them. You don't follow any model or any example, which is also great. You discover things on your own. I'm sure Butheina, when she started Cinema Akil, had examples here and there, but in the end, Butheina did things the way she thought things would work, or she would experiment with things until she discovers the balance of what could a cinema operate like in Dubai as an art house cinema. I think it's also that with films, every filmmaker, every producer, every team has to struggle so much. Khalid mentioned that there are films that take 5, 6, 7 years to be done. You know, you postulate as a project, they pick you up, they don't pick you up, you have to go somewhere else, you pitch there, you don't get the money, you go somewhere else. And then in the end, this project that you've been holding for 5 years, in the end, you're fed up with this project, you want to do something else. So basically for me, the term industry is a much bigger thing on the Arab world. What I would say is really there is a real strong will to do things, which is great and which should be fostered in a complete different way, in a sustainable way, to do things, you know, to operate in a way that these filmmakers, these artists would be able to do their work in a much more fluid way. And this is something that we don't have in the Arab world, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very ad hoc, and it's almost like every time you make a film, you're starting from scratch to figure out, how am I going to navigate the system? And I think there's an often repeated criticism of Arab cinema, which is that it generally relies on European funding for the most part. And you end up with a system that is trying to fulfill European cinema, let's say European art house cinema's ideals of Arab film. What the three of you, I mean, we can leave it open. What are your thoughts on that criticism?
If I may start, I would say what's really interesting now is that there are funders, there are film acting bodies, there are producers who are more interested in the authenticity of stories. And even though now finding a producer is really, you know, it's very open, there are so many people interested in the stories of the Global South, which is great, but you just really have to be wise in how you choose. I mean, this collaboration as a co-production is like a marriage, you know, you really need to know who you're working with. If they have a preset agenda, yesterday's talk with the three fantastic ladies, really, I mean, people come with preconceived agendas, and we want to see this from Egypt, and we want to see this from Sudan, and this is not interesting for our audience in Norway. In the end, it's my story. I have the right to do what I want and what I feel with this story. And for me, there is a start of an interesting discussions now happening between what you named actually as the funders of the Global North and the filmmakers of the Global South. And I think this should be like a mutual understanding of what I need from a producer, what I feel the producer will add to my story without making me do a film that I don't have in mind, actually.
But is it a trap, this sort of path that we're going down now? Because we risk creating cinema that is only popular outside our own countries?
I mean, it's one of the dangerous aspects of the current dynamic. There's no doubt about it. However, it's the question is where do we lay the blame, and to what extent does Arab cinema or Arab filmmakers internalize the blame of that?
Mm.
I mean, because there's no doubt that, you know, if we're living in countries, if they're even able to remain countries and not be split, or, you know, not have millions of us leaving them, if we're in countries in which there is no real accountability, then, you know, that seems to me a fundamental aspect of the pressures, because the energy certainly exists in Arab cinema and Arab filmmakers to create an industry, right? Give us, you know, if we had even mildly functioning social democratic states, in that sense, in which there was a relationship, you know, in which there was state funding and there was which is what exists everywhere. It's why you have a Swedish cinema, or why you have a French cinema, you know, I mean, or British cinema. I mean, every cinema. I mean, if we had that, then I mean, just imagine what we could do and what we would be doing. Right, but I mean, you know, look at the Gulf Film Festivals and what happened to them, and the opening and shutting, and I mean, just this is the landscape in which we work. So I find it, although I am critical often, and I'm not, without mentioning any names, but I'm critical of films and filmmakers that bow to that pressure. Mm-hmm. And I know very much so what it is to carry the difficulty of being resistant to that. And I think it ends up being each person's and each individual's and each filmmaker's, wherever they are in the chain of the filmmaking, it ends up being their responsibility to try and work out how to make something that strengthens their work. And I think to a large extent we do have that. However, we need to also look at it the other way. What does it do? Mm-hmm. It also creates an aesthetic. Right? Why do we have so many films that are, you know, one person with a camera on their hip, right? Or why do we have so many films? And this is not necessarily, some of those films are fantastic. They're some of my favorite films, actually, right? But you know, there's a reason why you don't see many, I don't know, Arab sci-fi films. Mm-hmm. Or even the number of animation films that we can do is few and far between. Or, you know, I always tell a joke in relation to The Narrow Frame of Midnight and In the Last Days of the City. Right? I met Tamer and Tala almost sort of a few weeks apart. And I was stuck. I tell a joke that I was stuck for 5 years of my life between a film that never ends and a film that never begins.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
The film that never begins finished before the film that never ends. So, you know, they held that space. Okay. However, they were two films that had to be made with that very different way, right? In the Last Days of a City is a film in which it was is a fictional film made in a documentary style, right? Shot almost as you would in any country in the world. And I have the benefit in Hollywood of working in fictional films like United 93 or with Paul Greengrass, where you are filming essentially, you're filming fictionally, but with the energy of documentary, and what that means then for the amount of footage that you're going to have, and so the editing process, right? What that requires from a budgetary level, what that requires from a planning perspective, what that requires from, you know, you do that, you know, so that was one film, In the Last Days of the City, in which the production model of what it required unfurled over time for us. And in some ways, maybe we couldn't have made it in a shorter period. We had a revolution in the middle and all sorts of things. The Narrow Frame of Midnight, on the other hand, is a film that I think in total has just over 300 cuts, mm-hmm. right? which for anyone who knows what that means, you know, your average film has about 1,000 or 2,000 cuts, and you know, it can go way more than that, right? But to have within your production method and how you're filming, the need to shoot with a particular length in a way that doesn't require cuts is an entirely different production model, right? Is an entirely different form of financing in terms of what it requires. And I saw between both and lived in my body there being also in the middle of that a documentary, The Square, and other documentaries that I was involved in and producers and trying to build spaces. You know, like I lived in my body the consequences of these decisions, right? And so like,
in a way, I mean,
just to sort of make that point about industries, the difference between, you know, because there's a part of me that wanted to just come in and say, I kind of agree with you that we don't have an industry in the sense that we don't have, you know, we don't have something functioning with a proper cycle, right? However, as soon as I take that word industry out, because maybe we don't need an industry, maybe what we need is a cinema, right? We do have a cinema, that's for sure. And one thing that I would say has actually been a big difference from 2012 till now, because it just occurred to me, which is a huge one, I think, for the region, not just the cinema. I mean, it was there in some of our cinemas beforehand, and particularly obviously Palestinian cinema, but the extent to which our diaspora identity has exploded as Arabs since 2012 is huge, you know? I mean, you know, and this is important, I guess, in the context of Arab British and even the name SAFAR, right? But this sense of the two places, I think intensely within our cinema and within our identity in general as Arabs has become even more, you know, even more split. I mean, try and take, you know, name any country and see that split, which I think in 2012 actually was much more so a space in which there was the authentic origin and there was the people that left for whatever reason, whether it was war or whether it was for a so-called economically better life or whatever the hell it is. Right now, everyone.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing that sort of diaspora experience represented in films a lot more, and, you know, and to great effect. Butheina, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I want to say that I think a lot of that also has to do with a generational shift and social media. I mean, I think that's a big part of it in terms of the, you know, the advocacy. There's sort of industry-wide advocacy for representational inclusion and, you know, and you know, what passes as Arab, and the, you know, sort of a decade-long sort of series of criticisms around the way that Arabs have been represented. I mean, you know, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, all we had was, you know, Jack Shaheen's Real Bad Arabs, and, you know, and Edward Said on the sort of the academic, you know, and all the sort of the, you know, post-colonial, you know, academic kind of realm of critiquing, you know, the representational sort of inclusion and you know, and narrative setting and so on. I think that has somehow also, following, you know, trends from social media and visibility of, you know, of the diaspora Arab, you know, younger generation as well, you know, in the sort of the public consciousness across different, you know, fields and across, you know, and I think it's all part of a larger constellation, you know, whether it's, you know, Mo Salah, whether it's, you know, Instagram, hijabi, you know, Muslims in North America becoming kind of the faces that, you know, people identify with outside of the, you know, exoticism of, you know, of what is, you know, waiting for a film to show you a certain part of the world. I think that sort of aspect of, we're not to be a technological determinist, because I think that flip side of that is also even more, you know, is more unknown and terrifying in a way, because the other side, I mean, there was no such thing as no strings attached, right? Even when you had, you know, Arab funding for Arab films, that changed the sort of the conversations, it changed the, you know, sort of the producer filmmaker dynamic and the expectations and the understanding and maybe different levels of scrutiny, but didn't mean that agendas suddenly disappeared and there was a sort of, you know, Arab utopia of, you know, unconditional, support for, for the kinds of films we were making at that time. So, and I think, filmmakers were successful in some cases of, pushing against that and subversively circumventing those, so those expectations or those agendas. And I think that's always been the case, whether you're dealing with European cinema, whether you're dealing with, with regional cinema with its own, political ramifications. That's always been the sort of the journey, of the Arab film, somehow, even if it's, it's your local, even if, you're talking within a local industry, Emirati filmmakers making films funded, in the UAE, which are, fewer and far in between, also have to navigate those, those parameters, and the political. So that's why you have so many, you're talking about no sci-fi films, the post-apocalyptic sci-fi genre film is like kind of the way of the future for the Gulf. You're seeing with Shams al-Ma'arif that just came out, you're seeing, a lot of different examples that are like kind of Arabian Alien by Mishal Jassim, for example, is another one. And there's a whole host of, of sort of interest in sci-fi because you're, that's kind of the only magical way you're grasping onto a sense of, and a sense of ability to navigate the circumstances. So there's that, so there's that sort of conventional, funding, funding filmmaker equilibrium. But what you have now is the introduction of the Netflix, sort of, production, right? And it's no longer about, Netflix acquiring rights en masse of Arab content and, and outbidding, the theatrical circuit at large for an independent Arab film, but you're actually getting into the, the possible, financing and production and, and creation of content and the ownership of the Arab image governed by the algorithmic, hierarchy. So that's a different, different power dynamic. And I don't think you've yet seen the full picture of that, the full slate of that. There's still a lot of like, technological determinism, a lot of optimism around, the possibility of accessing markets that you don't usually have. But what does it actually mean when you have a company like Netflix that, produces what is expected to be, told of the region? And how does that even get prioritized? How does that even end up, in the eyeballs of the spectators and the 16 million additional, subscribers that it claims to have, acquired in the past few months, of the lockdown in the region? So I think that's a whole other brave new world.
When you think of a single corporation deciding what your national cinema is going to look like, I mean, there's a huge amount of power and control there. And it also brings up one of the ironies, I think, of our call over the last sort of 10, 15 years for our governments to support national cinema more with funding. But of course, the price for that is that they will control it more. So I wonder if maybe Rabia, you can speak to it because you have a really broad view of funding structures as well, and you're part of them. Is it possible to have governments that are not free and not democratic funding cinema, but giving that cinema the space to be radical, authentic?
I don't know how to navigate that question. When I come from Beirut, and in Lebanon, the Ministry of Culture has the smallest budget of all ministries. In Lebanon at the moment, I fail to see a country before we see any like structure happening or taking place, or basically when I speak about Lebanon now at the moment after August 4th, which is after this terrible explosion that happened, the arts and culture has been particularly shaken by whatever happened. All the businesses, all the theaters, all the art galleries, the production houses, the offices, the houses of all filmmakers, all artists have been completely shattered. So I think it's also what Khalid has been saying a bit, we live in times that are, it's a constant, it's like a shape-shifting kind of thing that's happening in our country. So if you ask me that question about funding bodies, it could be that you establish a funding body that is governmental today that agrees on a structure to support filmmakers in this particular country. But the government that comes after it might reverse that, you know, and they just decide to do something completely different. They decide that filmmakers should work on their side. And I think for me, this is also a very dangerous thing. So I will just give you an example about censorship in Lebanon, for instance. Whoever runs the Ministry of Culture controls censorship in Lebanon. So it could be that what they are against today might be completely different of what they are against tomorrow, depending on who the governing body is. So for me, this question is really, I mean, I think it's a very long way to go still if we want to ask our governments to support our artistry, our culture, our way of doing things, because there is no dialogue with these people yet. You know, you cannot ask them to just support us without having any connection to these people. These people don't care about you. They don't listen to you. So, you know, I'm not sure even filmmakers themselves want to have support of governing bodies in Lebanon. We had, as Metropolis, support of the Ministry of Culture for 2 editions of an animation film festival. Oddly enough, we never saw a single penny. You know, so I'm not sure how this would translate on the ground. And I think before there is a process of a dialogue, before you know who these people are, before you can trust these people, you cannot ask for something like that. And I mean, I speak on my own behalf, but I'm not sure if filmmakers would like support of their governing bodies at this stage, at least.
True. I mean, it makes me wonder if we need much more robust non-governmental support structures that are not purely, you know, European cinema funds. We have a few, and I think they do great work, but still the majority of that money is coming from national governments. By the way, if anyone has questions, you can just type them in the question box. There's one here, and I'm going to try and roll it into the conversation. So,
but I think Khalid wanted to say something.
No, I had a couple of things in relation to that. I mean, it depends what we want, right? I mean, a lot of the non-governmental stuff is obviously hugely important to the current, to the survival of what we currently have. But I mean, you know, I would say that if we give up on our rights to what a state should mean to its people and its culture, then, you know, we can forget it. No organization can be strong enough to create the size of what is required really to have an industry. Like it's too much that's what's required, and it's about you know, opening so that those real possibilities can be had. And as I say, I mean, the energy of you know, were we given the space, the energy of what we were capable of strikes me as huge. I mean, you know, yeah, without going into, I mean, those of us that do it, or those of us that are close to doing it, know how hard it is. And also not just how hard it is, but how much you also, because it's cinema, you have to present the face of kind of pretending that none of that exists. Right?
Sure, but I mean, the irony being that cinema is, at least art cinema, you know, art house cinema, is very often a vehicle for creative criticism, you know, for radical critique of a government. It's been a medium that allows, you know, maybe it's related to what we were discussing with sci-fi. One of the sort of historical strengths of sci-fi is that it satirizes without being too direct. So it's a great way of criticizing your government, and if you get into trouble, you say, oh no, this isn't Egypt, this is a different nation in the year 2050 that has no relation to the government of Egypt. You know?
But I mean, like, I don't know, for example, if you were to imagine some situation where it was through people making donations, or, you know, some kind of charitable method in which, like, you know, I mean, there are very few countries in the Arab region even where that's possible, you know, like you can go to prison for doing that in Egypt. So, you know, that closed down a particular area of support. I think in Lebanon it's a bit more open, but in other countries it's not. But anyway, one of the other things that I wanted to make, which is taking it away from not exactly the structural element, but it strikes me that nonetheless, right? One of the challenges that we face as filmmakers broadly, or people within, you know, within this industry in relation to Arab concerns generally, or Arab cinema and Arab culture, is we do recognize, right, that there is still, we want to be closer to our audiences in our countries, right? It's very simple, but you put it as simply as that. And it is still the case, sadly, that that your regular audience member in the Arab region will probably not trust, before they go and see a film, they'll probably not trust that in going they will enjoy it or be entertained or get what they thought that they were going to get, right? And fundamentally, that's again, I don't blame the filmmakers for that. I think that's an entire big structural issue that you can't get without solving distribution, that you won't get without this positive relationship between the state and the cultural sector in general, right? However, nonetheless, there is, I think, and this is something that I do think that we as a generation from before 2012, but have been trying to do, but are still trying to do, but it's kind of like understand where that, with the intellectual work to find that place that creates a cinema that feels authentic to ourselves, but does some of those things of entertaining and of creating that dynamic of huge support and love that also has a space for the breadth of what we're trying to do. And I think that in some ways, because we don't have that, that also on filmmakers creates a pressure, because you're probably not going, you know, because there are things that are very difficult to happen. So we end up pitching ourselves, I would say, not to European tastes, right? But there's also very often a pitching to kind of intellectual posterity.
Sure.
Which I think is very important, right? And in some ways it's the hardest thing to do. But I do think that there remains a kind of responsibility on us to try and find that, you know, that space that makes it easier to grow.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that most of the art house Arab films that are made are either completely unknown or just very marginally successful in their own countries. You know, some that will never have been seen in their own countries. So,
but you know what, I want to say that you do have a lot of the, you know, you have a sort of a rise of the cusp film, right? Like the films that are somehow, you know, bringing this world into the next and trying to create these, you know, and they do face a lot of criticism, and they, you know, there are, you know, there's definitely, you know, sort of, you know, challenges of, you know, of pandering to a certain, you know, aspect of the industry or certain audiences over others and so on. But there are some examples of films that tend to always go through the cycle of the sort of the reverse import model, you know, that do end up having some level of notoriety or success back in their audiences, should they get recognition, you know, elsewhere, or, you know, get, you know, some sort of, you know, hat tip, you know, from the Academy, or, you know, win some sort of prize, you know, in a major festival. And that remains the trapping of the, you know, of the film circuit journey. You know, it's you know, and you know, some of it is editorial, and some of it is the actual, you know, stylistic choices and the, you know, the language of the film. And a big part of it is also, you know, the sort of the trappings of the ecosystem, you know, of Veeb needing to go get nominated, you know, for an Oscar, to, you know, to be able to get this kind of interest back in its home country, this like reverse import, you know, whether it's Kafar Home, whether it's even Satamutu fil 20, or You Will Die at 20, you know, it has had a bit of a different, you know, a different journey, because there was also this kind of, you know, euphoric moment of, you know, of arrival, of the return of sort of the you know, the Sudanese film, along with, you know, the not Freedom Fields, Khartoum Offside and talking to trees, but it was sort of the palatable, and romantic and and sort of friendly face, that had the sort of also the blessings, and the sort of the journey, of all the international, intellectually acceptable as well, like the festivals that pandered to both worlds. It had enough of an audience appeal, and also was considered part of the required intellectual stress test, that is put on filmmakers themselves. And I think if there's anything that I would like to see a little bit more of is compassion, not from our audiences, because I think Arab audiences are at the end as I think as beautiful and as loving of of our cinema, as can be. And I think there are challenges, structural challenges, distribution, film literacy, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on, but there is still this kind of sense of like I remember when we programmed Rabih, we always go back to this to this story of before the sort of the new wave of Sudanese film. There was a short film by Mohammed Kordofani, Narkook, and Rabih. Yeah, and you want to tell the story because you curated the program here in Abu Dhabi.
We programmed this film. It's a short film by Mohammed Kordofani called Narkook. We programmed it with Butheina in Abu Dhabi. We had a program in Abu Dhabi called On Arab Geographies, and we programmed this film because we believed in that film, and it was a film from Sudan. We were very excited about it, and all of a sudden we had this supremely beautiful audience of people coming from all over the UAE, which for me, I had no idea there was such a Sudanese community coming in. The colorful people, the faces who just came to see that Sudanese short. For me, this was really fantastic that you can take chances on the audience and you might not know what you get. So for me, this is also that experiment with Butheina. We're like, what the hell is happening here? For me, this is really, it's really why you want to do things, why as a programmer, it's fantastic for you to discover these stories, to show these stories, to reach out to an audience. And one thing I want to say, I mean, on a positive note, because this was really, I would say, a heavy talk in regards to what Khalid said, the stories that we produced starting 2012. There are fantastic stories emerging from the Arab world. There are also, you mentioned sci-fi. There is also a rise in the genre film. There are so many films now tackling genre film in the Arab world. There are LGBTIQ stories that people are able to see. Sometimes they're banned in their own countries, but you see them elsewhere in the Arab world, not necessarily outside. There are female stories also that are being told today, which is also fantastic. I think there is a wide range of things in the Arab world, and what Butheina said also is very, very true. These stories need to be supported. These stories need to be made, and these stories need to be told, but also these stories need to find their audience. And for me, the richness of the Arab world, whether you have a Sudanese film or Freedom Fields from Naziha Arabi from Libya, or you have the next stories emerging from Yemen, this is it adds to the richness of the Arab world. Whether people struggle to make these films, this is a real thing, of course. But in the end, it's important that these films find their audience, not just in a big festival or get nominated to the Oscars, but also in their own countries and the Arab world.
Yeah, and I think that in a way, that's how I would define an industry. Like you said, Rabia, there is no industry, but it's a system that can support the entire range from the mainstream, conventional, commercial cinema to those much smaller art house cinemas and still find an audience in their home country, right? It doesn't necessarily all have to be a profit-making system. Like we talk about European countries that have subsidized cinema, and that's great. But there still needs to be a space for all those films to exist. Do we need to wrap it up, Amani, or do you have time for a question? There's a question that we could get to here if we have time.
I think we're running out of time, but I think it's just been such an interesting conversation. I think we should probably try and wrap up the 2 questions that we have, and then of course if people have to go, then they can also leave. But yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll read these out. So from Ashtar, she says, what is an authentic voice, and who gets to decide what is authentic in terms of a voice or the choices a filmmaker makes? Any of you can give us your thoughts. It's a big question as well.
I mean, it's obviously it's a very big question, and
Can I say something?
Sure.
It's something that I, as a filmmaker, I'm very preoccupied with at the moment, being a second generation Arab filmmaker. I really question what is authentic. How do people define what is my voice authentic? What stories is one who is once removed in a position to tell? You know, that's really because you're all filmmakers here of one sort or another, that's really the question that I was interested in, rather than this enormous kind of profound notion of authenticity that it's impossible to answer. Mm-hmm. But just to really try and bore down a bit into who has the right to make what, I suppose. Is that an equally difficult question? I don't know. Sorry, anyway, to interrupt.
I mean, my short answer is that your voice is authentic, Ashraf, knowing you and knowing your films. I mean, like Khalid described the sort of boom in diaspora Arab filmmaking, and there's no reason in my mind why that's any less authentic than the Arab who still lives in their home country.
I mean, yeah, absolutely, for sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think sort of as it's not a very useful term, authentic. But I think
totally agree with that.
I guess the question is, why do we end up using it to a certain extent? And I think part of the reason is that clearly as a region, we end up having huge pressures on us to perform particular identities that have a political value for people who don't come from our region. And I would say that it relates to that particular minefield in terms of what that then means. And for me, the question of authenticity then comes down to the individual that's making the work.
Yeah,
that's the source. That's the source of it. I don't think it's a matter of where you come from. It's a matter of how the work is animated through the authenticity of whatever that person is searching for. But definitely we end up using that word because of how complicated and how much we are, you know, we are instrumentalized. And I think for me, really, probably instrumentalized would be a better word, because so often our work is instrumentalized, either in the reasons for why some of the films become successes, so-called, or for the reasons that they don't. I think it's to me the key would go into this question of whether or not whether or not the film ends up being instrumentalized, because sometimes that's appropriate, but it's how the film dances with the question of instrumentalization.
I mean, I've often heard the word, I think more often as a criticism than as a sort of a positive or badge of honor, in that funders or funding bodies will say they don't feel the story is authentic. And what that usually means is they don't understand the entire breadth of the Arab experience. And so if you make a sci-fi film, that's not what they want to see, because that doesn't seem authentic to them. Or if you make a comedy, a Palestinian comedy, that doesn't seem authentic to them, and they want a gritty docudrama about life under occupation. So I agree.
It often comes from our region as well, though, you know, in relation to our cinema being European, apparently, right? Art house cinema as a genre, wherever you're making it, is apparently then not Lebanese or not Egyptian. I mean, it's certainly not Egyptian, because we know what Egyptian cinema is, apparently, you know, like, and that's where, for me, actually, this question of what it means for an Arab identity in general to become a diaspora identity also. You know, I'm sure there are all sorts of issues around authenticity with Palestinian cinema, but, you know, being Palestinian, for example, or being Iraqi now, is to have a totally different relationship with who and where you have a right to speak from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for better or worse, I think that's becoming the case for all of our cinemas.
Yeah, I do think it's one of those terms that you said. I mean, like, I think there's just been a lot of violence, I think, attached to this, use of the word, of authenticity and questions of authenticity, almost to, to a dehumanization, level of works that do come from from an authentic place, that do come from, driven by personal stories and personal experience. And because either we internally have, conflicted ideas of, what an Arab, realpolitik looks like, or what an Arab aesthetic looks like, and what kind of confines we're supposed to, operate within. There's internal pressure of, of your audience, of you representing, your national cinema or your regional cinema, or all the identities that are tacked onto your film, that it almost, morphs into something beyond a story. It morphs into something that escapes the personal. And, I would think that in this landscape, that tends to, lack a certain degree of compassion, for that, a discovery of authenticity. I think a level of myopia, and a level of the extreme or radical, personal, I think, I guess, experience, is possibly the most authentic thing you can do, given all these pressures that exist, on you, upon you, and by yourself. So that's kind of been my, my takeaway in the past few years, like programming, regional cinema, is that it's very difficult. It's very difficult for the filmmakers, and it's difficult for, for them on so many levels, because of this, this constant, questioning, this constant, it's almost like a, this strange, like birther movement, around cinema, that is extremely ugly sometimes, in questioning, especially Arab diaspora experiences, especially returnee Arab diaspora experiences that, do choose to come back and make films, in their countries, and, and become, for, logistical, documentative, reasons, I guess, privy to certain industry dynamics that allow them to have some level of, of privilege in, getting through to the right, film festivals, or getting, having certain conversations that maybe, their fellow filmmakers in X city in the Arab world won't necessarily have, because of a language barrier or so on, or even a geographic barrier often. There's a lot of this kind of, I think, a lot of this violence. And I think we need to, at least in these industries, or that industry, or in this kind of constantly rupturing, notion of what Arab identity is, and its respective cinemas, I think, we need to somehow find a way of creating that real, solidarity and that support, and dismantling this idea of this conversation of authenticity.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of infighting and aggression towards other people who, either are successful or successful in different ways, or using mechanisms different ways, or so let's try and cover the last question, and then we got to wrap it up. This is from Nadia, who says, I will try and summarize it here. It's really important to me that our film, in development since 2016, connects to British and Moroccan audiences, as well as within Arab cinema as a whole, but I'm struggling with not being able to travel and connect with others from the MENA region. Do you have any lockdown hacks for how best to utilize this time distance, please? So I guess it's sort of, how can we use this kind of platform that we're working in now to create connections with Arab audiences, even if we can't be there physically? Any thoughts on that?
I mean,
hire a really good growth hacker.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, one of my great friends, Tala, who, you know, I speak to her regularly, and she's, you know, she's in Morocco currently, and, you know, the state of lockdown since lockdown has been there is, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know, in every various country, I mean, anywhere are we connecting with each other other than through these digital spaces? I mean, and, you know, our film festivals in general, those of them that are still able to go, are definitely a major part of allowing those connections to at least continue. But I don't know. I mean, I think that for me anyway, this particular space that we're in right now, I don't want to say it's necessarily demanding more inwards than it is outwards, but I would say there's a lot of readying that we need to do for when the world unlocks. That's, I mean, that for me is a big part of, I don't know, that for me is a big part of the emphasis right now. I don't know what else there is in terms of hacks. I mean, for me, maybe a very important hack insofar as we can, because there have been opportunities. I have 2 kids who are 4 and almost 3, so it's been hard, but it's to watch, is to get to know our cinema even better, to watch each other's films. That is still a problem, and was a problem in 2012, and is why I would assume things like SAFAR, you know, SAFAR and all of these other festivals have been, you know, and we've been trying to set up our spaces, because even as filmmakers, we have problems seeing each other's films. I would say one of the biggest things to do during this time, if you have the time and energy, is to watch each other's films more, you know. Find them, get them, which is why it's so important what SAFAR has done, and what, you know, and various other, and, you know, AFAC was putting on lots of films, and various other funding bodies and organizations have been trying to make their films available. That's still a big one that we have to solve, you know, is how we get to see each other's films. But yeah, I've been spending a lot of time watching, you're just filling in gaps in my knowledge of Arab cinema, especially during the lockdown. And I think, you know, honestly, I've found maybe more solidarity under lockdown than before, because people are online a lot more and people do have access to each other's films. You know, I've been communicating with other filmmakers and practitioners around the world. So for me, it's been a positive time, but obviously it's also very disconnecting.
I mean, the other thing I would say on that is, I mean, definitely catch up on the films wherever you can get them. But also, there are a lot of platforms that have sort of come up organically, you know, during lockdown, that have, you know, brought to light, you know, whether it's talents or conversations, you know, or even informal, you know, webinars or talks, where you do have the opportunity to really like get into like really intimate, you know, spaces and conversations where you usually wouldn't in a forum like a film festival. You know, and you do have to do a lot of research to kind of look at where that's happening, and the format of the Zoom conversation also makes a big difference in terms of, you know, what kind of room you're in. You're in a room with, you know, 50 participants. It's going to be hard for you to, you know, make a connection. But there's been a tremendous amount of, you know, whether it's like, you know, experiments like Rabih el Khoury, for example, that came out of, you know, of Palestine, that, you know, was hosting everything from, you know, conversations to music to, you know, talent, that, you know, of people you would have maybe heard, you know, play great sets, you know, in Ramallah or, you know, in other cities, and, you know, weren't able to connect, that were able to create this amazing community in a matter of months of, you know, all these like, you know, music makers and DJs and, you know, and talents that are even outside of that sphere. You know, so I guess like find where those networks of, you know, of solidarity are in the larger spectrum, because like Khalid was saying, and Rabia also, you know, the network of Arab audiences and the Arab ecosystem tends to be multi-tiered within one space of, you know, of what you would classify as exclusively the arts, or, you know, or music, or different industries tend to collapse in the region. So I would say look outside of just the film space to find these conversations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's really funny. I would say very briefly, I wanted to say, I would recommend people to be curious enough, because that's the right time to be curious if you have the time for that, and also be selective. The amount of offer online is tremendous. It's really huge, and don't feel like you need to catch up on this and that. And, you know, sometimes it's good to make choices. You don't want to be overwhelmed with everything. You don't have to see everything, but sometimes you see a film. Khalid was mentioning that we should see each other's films, which is fantastic. But sometimes seeing a complete different film that you have not heard about before, that comes from a different region, this could be also enriching, inspiring, enlightening, whatever. I would say the offer is really incredible, but one have to make choices because otherwise you're flooded with this amount of information that really tricks you into going to different directions. So if you have a particular audience that you want to reach out to, they mentioned the Moroccan one, reach out to that, check what's available. Butheina was saying there's so much more than just the film business. You could also find other ways of supporting or reaching out to the community, which is not necessarily through film, but your film can reach out to this community in complete different ways.
Great. We do need to wrap it up. We've run over, but I hope for good reasons, because it was a big topic, and I think we got some really good conversation going.